Hi guys, welcome back. If you're new here, subscribe and drop your comment. Tonight's story is about a cool janitor hiding underground during the first brutal winter of the zombie outbreak, trying to stay quiet while the infected move through the frozen dark above him. So, let's get started.
My name is Martin Cobb. I am 50 years old. I have been head custodian at Birchwood Falls Elementary School for 11 years, 3 months, and about 2 weeks before all of this started. I also referee minor hockey on weekends, sometimes Thursdays too, during playoff season, which means I know every gravel road within 60 kilometers of here, and I know how to hold steady when someone is shouting at me from close range. I have been yelled at by angry parents, by drunk coaches, by a farmer once who drove his truck onto the ice surface because he thought I'd missed a high stick. None of that prepared me for September. The evacuation happened on the 3rd and 4th of September. The school had been officially closed since the 31st of August, early closure, the board said, due to the health situation developing in the eastern part of the province. Nobody used plain language back then. Health situation, civil disturbance, isolated incident. My brother Terry called me on September 2nd and said he would come up from Moose Jaw to drive me out. He said the highways were getting complicated and I shouldn't drive alone. He said he'd be at the school by 4 o'clock on the 4th. 4 o'clock came and went. 5 o'clock. The parking lot was empty except for my truck and a county public works vehicle that somebody had left running near the front entrance. Engine going, driver's door open. I watched it from the second floor window for 2 hours. Nobody came back for it. At 7 in the evening, I went out and shut it off myself because the noise was starting to pull things out of the tree line to the east, things that moved wrong, too stiff in the joints, heads tilted forward. I'd seen 2 of them already that afternoon, working along the fence line at the edge of the soccer field, and I'd gone back inside and locked the main entrance and the side gym door and every ground floor window I could find. I didn't know what they were then. I don't think anyone did. Not clearly. The province had been putting out advisories about individuals in acute medical distress who might behave erratically and should be avoided. That was the language they used. Acute medical distress. The 2 I'd watched through the window were moving with broken mechanics. Like something inside them had slipped out of alignment, one dragging its right leg, the other moving in short, searching arcs with its face turned up as if tracking a smell. They weren't fast. They stopped at the chain link fence and pressed against it without trying to climb. I watched them do that for 20 minutes, and then I stopped watching. Terry never came. I found out later, months later, from a woman passing through who'd come from Moose Jaw, that the highway south of Lumsden had been blocked since the morning of the 4th. I don't know exactly what happened to Terry. I have some ideas. I don't spend time on them. I stayed in the school because I knew the building, and I had keys to every room in it. That was the whole calculation at first. I had my truck outside, but the nearest town with a gas station was 38 kilometers away, and I'd heard what sounded like a collision somewhere on the county road around midday on the 4th. A hard, flat, bang, and then nothing. And I didn't want to drive toward that without knowing what it was. So I stayed one night, then another. By the 3rd day, I stopped thinking about leaving as something that was going to happen soon. The school has 2 main buildings, connected by a covered walkway, the original 1963 structure, with the gym, boiler room, and lower storage, and the addition built in 1991 with the classrooms and the library. I knew every pipe run, every electrical panel, every door that didn't latch properly, and every lock that needed to be persuaded. I knew which window frames had gaps in the weather stripping because I'd been meaning to replace them for 2 years, and the budget never came through. The building was mine in a way it had never quite been during the school year. The first week, I stayed in the custodian's room in the original building, a 10 by 12 foot room with a utility sink, a space heater, a folding table, and a shelf of supplies I'd accumulated over the years. Cleaning chemicals, spare hardware, 2 boxes of contractor garbage bags, 3 flashlights, and a battery-powered radio that still pulled in a signal from Regina if I held the antenna at the right angle. The signal from Regina went out on the 9th of September. I didn't hear another broadcast for 6 weeks after that. The dead, and I'm going to call them the dead, because that's what they were once I understood what I was dealing with. Though it took time to accept that word moved through the area in small groups. 1 to 3, mostly. Occasionally 5 or 6 together, which was worse because they seemed to respond to each other's movement and noise in ways that made them drift in the same direction. I watched them from windows. I learned to recognize some of them. There was one in a green work jacket, a man I was almost certain had been a hydro technician because of the company logo on the chest, and he turned up in the schoolyard every few days, always from the north side, always moving east. I named him Greencoat in my head. I don't know why I did that. It helped, maybe, to have something to track. I found the civil defense room on the 14th of September. I'd been in the lower gym storage before. Obviously it was part of my building. Folded volleyball nets, broken gymnastic horses, floor hockey sticks sorted by length in a metal rack, a rusting floor polisher that nobody had used since 2006. The hatch was in the back corner, behind a set of shelving units I'd never fully moved because they were bolted to the wall at the top, and I'd never had a reason to pull them. But I was looking for tarps, and I'd run through the ones in the main storage room, so I moved the shelving, just unbolted the top brackets, and there it was. A steel hatch, flush with the concrete floor, with a recessed pull ring set into it. The hinges had surface rust, but they moved when I pulled. The hatch swung up. The room below was about 12 feet by 20 feet, with a low ceiling 6.5 feet, maybe, and walls of poured concrete. There were wooden shelves along 3 sides, most of them still holding supplies. Sealed cans of food from the 1970s, green military-style containers labeled in black stencil, a stack of wool blankets sealed in vacuum bags, a hand-crank generator the size of a suitcase, and 4 sealed drums labeled potable water, civil defense. The school had been built in 1963, during a period when every public building in Canada was supposed to have a shelter component. Most of them had been stripped out over the decades, or simply forgotten. This one had been forgotten. The first thing I did after I found it was nothing. I sat on the ladder with the hatch open above me and the room below me, and I looked at the shelves in the beam of my flashlight for a while. The stenciled labels on the military containers said things like emergency rations, 72-hour, first aid kit standard, communications manual volume 3, water purification tablets. There were also 2 steel-cased lanterns with intact mantles, a folded paper map of Saskatchewan and the northern United States, still in its original government printing envelope, and a wooden crate of candles, hundreds of them, church-style, white, each wrapped in wax paper and packed in sawdust. I tested one of the emergency ration cans. It opened without issue, and the contents, a dry biscuit and a compressed fruit block, were unpleasant but edible. The water in the drum still tested clean on the purification strip I found in the first aid kit. That was the moment I understood I was going to survive longer than I'd thought. I spent 3 days moving supplies and organizing the room. I brought down my bedroll and the folding table from the custodian's room, my radio and spare batteries, the 3 flashlights, and the food I'd pulled from the cafeteria stockroom, cases of canned soup, boxes of oatmeal, dried pasta, canned fruit, and about 60 liters of water in jugs I'd filled from the school's supply before I started worrying about pressure. I brought the space heater down and ran an extension cord up through the hatch. I checked the ventilation, 2 narrow concrete pipes near the ceiling, both covered with mesh, both opening somewhere in the gym exterior wall. Cold air came through them, which meant they were clear. I blocked them both with folded cloth during the coldest nights. By late September, there were more of the dead moving through the area. I didn't have a count. I couldn't see the whole perimeter from any single window, but the numbers had grown from the occasional 1 or 2 to what seemed like a steady rotation of 8 to 12 in the schoolyard, parking lot at any given time during daylight hours. They did not appear to be looking for anything specifically. They moved, they stopped, they changed direction when they heard something. Sound was the main trigger. A car alarm on the county road, 3 kilometers away, pulled 6 of them northeast in the span of 4 minutes on the 27th of September. I watched that from the gym loft and made a note of it. The school had a fenced compound on the east side, the playground area, and the fence was chain link, 8 feet tall, with the top rail still intact. The dead leaned against it, but didn't climb it consistently. 2 of them managed it over the course of those first weeks, pulling themselves over without apparent effort, but they were the exception. The fence held most of them out of the east yard, which was where I needed to move when I went outside to check the rabbit snares. I set the first snares on the 1st of October. I'd read about wire snares in a wilderness manual in the school library, the kind with a fixed loop at the entrance, and I improvised with the wire I had in the maintenance room. I set 5 along the fence line at the far east corner, where the snow would pile against the chain link and where I'd seen rabbit tracks crossing the yard at night. The tracks were clear in the new snow. Rabbits don't care about any of what's happening to us. The first snare took a rabbit on the 5th of October. I processed it in the lower kitchen area of the cafeteria, used a knife from the cafeteria prep counter, and cooked the meat over a camp stove I'd found in the janitor's closet, along with 4 fuel canisters. I was careful about smell. Cooking inside, ventilation managed. The smoke went through the main HVAC return, which I'd partially blocked to reduce exterior output, but the smell still spread through the building, and I cracked a second-floor window briefly to dilute it. A group of 4 of the dead came to the north side of the building 40 minutes later and moved along the wall, stopping and starting, for about 2 hours. I stayed very still in the crawl space above the ground floor until they drifted back toward the road. October turned cold early that year. The first hard frost came on the 8th, and by the 15th, there was snow on the ground that wasn't going to melt again until April. That was the first time I noticed what the cold was doing to them. They slowed down. Not all at once and not dramatically. It wasn't as though they stopped functioning. But their movement became stiffer, more deliberate, with a mechanical quality that hadn't been there in September, when some of them had moved close to a run when triggered by sound. Now, in -15 Celsius, they moved at a slow walk. Their hands moved less. The ones that had been showing damage to their faces and necks, torn skin, exposure from days outside, were visibly stiffened in those areas. The tissue thickened and darkened. Some of them had patches of white frost on their clothing by morning. They didn't react to it. The cold didn't stop them. That was the part I had to accept. I'd half hoped that a proper Saskatchewan winter would take care of the problem the way it takes care of most problems out here, by making it too cold for anything to function. But they functioned. Slowly, stiffly, silently for the most part, but they functioned. And the cold did something else that made things worse in a specific way. It made sound carry farther. In dry, frozen air with no wind and no ambient noise from traffic or machinery or wildlife, a sound travels. A dropped tool, a cough, a door handle rattling. Things I'd been careless about in September became things I couldn't afford anymore. I found the shotgun at the Pelletier farm, about 1.4 kilometers southwest of the school, on the 22nd of October. I'd gone out at first light, the shortest window of reasonable visibility, before the dead that were frozen against the north wall started moving with the temperature rise, and I'd cut across the field to the farmhouse. The back door was unlocked. The family was gone, the place gone cold, a water pipe already cracked in the kitchen from the freeze. In the mudroom I found rubber boots, a heavy canvas coat that fit me, and a pair of insulated work gloves. In the bedroom closet, behind a stack of wool sweaters, a 12-gauge side-by-side shotgun, and 2 boxes of shells, about 50 rounds total, mixed birdshot and deer slugs. I took it all. I left a tin of cookies on the counter. I don't know why I did that either. The shotgun changed my feeling about going out, not my caution. I stayed as careful as before, but the feeling underneath it. There is a difference between stepping outside with only a snow shovel and a Halligan bar and stepping outside with a 12-gauge across your arm. The snow shovel was from the school's equipment storage. The Halligan bar I'd taken from the fire cabinet in the east hallway, a heavy forged steel tool used for forcing entry, about 90 centimeters long, with a prying fork on one end and an adze on the other. Heavy, solid, good for pushing, prying, or putting controlled distance between yourself and something that has no business being near you. I'd used it twice in October, once to redirect one of the slow ones away from the fence while I retrieved a snare, and once to deal with one that had gotten into the east yard and positioned itself directly in front of the gate I needed to use. I didn't think of it as a weapon. It was a tool. November. The temperature dropped to -25 on most nights and held between -12 and -18 during the day. The snow was a meter deep against the north wall of the school. I could see the outline of 4 or 5 of the frozen ones through the gym windows, standing motionless in the drifts, arms at their sides. They looked like figures someone had placed there deliberately. When the temperature rose above -8 in the afternoon, the closest ones would begin to move again, slow, shuffling quarter circles, nearly blind in the bright snow glare, but responsive to any sound that reached them. My routine was narrow. Mornings, check the boiler and the vent pipes. Check snares if the temperature and perimeter allowed going outside. Catalogue remaining supplies. Afternoons, maintenance tasks around the building, reading from the school library, one careful pass through every corridor to check for entry points and structural issues. Evenings, radio scan even though I hadn't picked up a clear signal in weeks. One hot meal on the camp stove, limited flashlight use. I went to sleep at 9, woke at 5. I kept a log in a composition notebook I found in the classroom supply room. I wrote the date, the temperature, the count of the dead if I could get a visual, weather notes, and what I'd eaten. It was something to do with my hands that wasn't panic. I had 3 encounters with living people in November and early December. Each one went the same way, more or less, and I'm not proud of any of them. The first was a couple, a man and a woman in their 30s, both moving efficiently, both carrying full backpacks, who came up the county road on a clear afternoon around the 12th of November. I watched them from the second-floor window. They saw my truck in the parking lot. They tried the front door, found it locked, and knocked. Not loud, they knew better than loud. The man knocked 3 times, quietly, and then called out, "Anyone in there?" just above a whisper. I stood 6 feet back from the window and watched them. I didn't answer. They stood there for about 10 minutes, looking at the building, and then the woman said something to the man that I couldn't hear, and they left north along the road. I stayed at the window until they were out of sight. There were 2 of them, and I had calculated, probably incorrectly, that 2 more people would mean the food going twice as fast, the risk of noise doubling, and the heat loss from the shelter increasing every time the hatch was opened and closed. I talked myself into not opening the door. I did it convincingly. The second was a man alone, maybe 60, with a sled loaded with equipment. He came from the west on the 28th of November and made a camp in the tree line, about 300 meters from the school. I watched him for 2 days. He was competent, fire, discipline, good, movement, quiet, camp kept small. On the 30th, he walked across the field toward the school. I was on the second floor and I watched him come. He stopped at the parking lot edge and looked at the building for a long time, then turned around and walked back to his camp. He was gone by the next morning. He never called out, never knocked, never approached the entrance. He just looked. I don't know what he decided. The third was Deb Hauk. She came from the east on December 7th, on foot, carrying nothing but a school backpack and a walking stick that looked like a broom handle with electrical tape wrapped around the grip. She was in her mid-40s, wide shoulders, moving in short, deliberate steps the way you do in deep snow when you're watching your footing. She walked straight toward the school's east fence, found the gate I'd been using, and saw the tracks in the snow, my tracks, going in and out, unmistakably recent. She stood at the gate for a long time, looking at the tracks, then looked up at the building. I was in the gym loft, looking down at her. She couldn't see me. After a moment she said, not loudly, "I see you've been in and out recently. I'm not going to make noise or cause a problem. I just need somewhere warm for a night." I didn't answer. She waited. Then she said, "I've got a small propane cylinder, mostly full, And I know what's in the boiler room of schools like this one, because I worked maintenance for the Battleford School Division for 8 years. She waited again. I stayed silent. She stood at the gate for another 20 minutes, then turned and walked back east the way she'd come. I watched her go until she crossed the county road. I should have opened the gate. She had information I needed. She had fuel. She was alone and quiet, and clearly experienced. I went through the calculation again, same as with the couple. Heat, food, noise, risk. I talked myself into the same answer. I watched her disappear and went back down to the shelter and wrote the date in my notebook and nothing else. That night, I ran through the Deb Houck calculation again while I was not sleeping, not to question the decision I had made it, and I didn't unmake decisions because they felt bad, but to make sure the logic still held in the dark. 2 liters of water per person per day. Current stock, 114 liters, plus the shelter drums. Add a second person. The runway, shortened by roughly half. Heat. Every time the hatch was opened for 2 bodies instead of 1, cold air came in and warm air went out, and the space heater worked harder and the fuel canister ran down faster. Noise. Another person coughing, moving, shifting in their sleep. I'd been alone long enough that I'd recalibrated my own sense of how much noise a person makes, and I did not miss having that problem. I ran through all of it, and it came out the same way it had at the window. And then I lay there in the dark for another hour, which was not something I could put in a calculation, but which was probably telling me something. December moved like a slow compression. The temperature averaged -30. The boiler, a 1982 gas-fired unit that I'd been coaxing along since October, began showing signs of trouble around December 12th. The pilot was cycling erratically, dropping out and relighting, dropping out again. The circulator pump was making a grinding sound that wasn't there in September. I serviced it as well as I could with what I had. The school's maintenance supplies included boiler descaler, pipe thread compound, and a full set of wrenches. I replaced the circulator pump strainer, cleaned the pilot assembly, and bled the radiator lines on the ground floor. It helped for a week. Then on the 20th of December, the boiler shut down completely at 2 in the morning, and the building temperature began dropping. By 7 in the morning, the main floor was at -4 Celsius. The shelter below the gym was holding better, the ground around it was still above freezing, and the wool blankets and my body heat kept it at maybe 5 or 6 degrees, but I couldn't stay down there indefinitely without the boiler. The pipes in the building would start fracturing within 12 hours at those temperatures, which would cost me running water when spring came and eventually compromise the structure if the freeze-thaw cycle got into the walls. I was in the boiler room with a flashlight and my toolkit when I heard them at the front entrance. It was 8:15 in the morning. 3 knocks, firm, deliberate. Not the tentative tapping of someone frightened of noise. These were knocks made by someone who'd already decided they were coming in. I went to the ground floor window at the end of the east hallway and angled my view toward the front. 3 people. Deb Houck in the center, her broom handle stick in her left hand. On her right, a man in a red hunting jacket and work boots, stocky, maybe 50, head bare carrying a pry bar. On her left, a taller man in a snowmobile suit, thinner, moving his weight from foot to foot in the cold. I recognized Deb immediately. I didn't know the other 2. The stocky man in the red jacket, I found out his name was Phil. Turneau went to the front door and hit it twice with the flat of the pry bar. Not hard enough to force it, but hard enough to make a sound that carried across the parking lot and out into the frozen yard. I watched 2 of the slow ones near the tree line lift their heads and begin turning toward the building. I went to the second floor window above the entrance and opened it 6 inches. "Keep it quiet," I said. Deb looked up immediately. She'd known where to look. "Martin," she said. She'd seen my truck and known my name. I'd had a parking sticker from the school division on the rear window with my name and staff number printed on it. "The boiler's out. We can see the frost on the windows from here. You need someone who knows these systems." She gestured at Phil Turneau. "Phil worked commercial HVAC for 20 years. He can get it running again." "And what's the price of that?" I said. Phil Turneau looked up at the open window. We come in. We share what's in there. We stay until spring. His voice was flat and he wasn't asking. The taller one, Wade Koppel, I learned later, was watching the parking lot, tracking the two slow ones that had started drifting toward the noise. He said, "We need to move this conversation inside." He wasn't wrong about that. I watched the two slow ones, now joined by a third from the north, moving across the snow in the direction of the front entrance. They were still 60 meters out, but they were aimed correctly, and in still air, voices carry. I said, "Give me 10 minutes. I closed the window and went down to the shelter and stood at the bottom of the access ladder for a moment. 10 minutes, I'd said. I used 8 of them. I let them in through the east gym door. I unlocked it from inside and opened it and stepped back with the Halligan bar across both hands where they could see it. Phil Turneau came in first, pry bar still in his hand, and he took one look at the Halligan and nodded like we'd just agreed on something unspoken. Deb came in second, backpack and walking stick, eyes already moving across the gym, cataloguing. Wade Koppel came in last and pulled the door shut and slid the bolt without being told. He was observant, at least. I noted that. "Boiler room," Phil said, not asking. He'd been in enough schools to know the layout. I took them through the covered walkway to the original building, Phil and Deb behind me, Wade at the rear. In the boiler room, I stepped back and let Phil work. He crouched in front of the unit, pulled off the access panel with practiced ease, and spent 4 minutes looking at the internals. He didn't say anything. His hands moved quickly, but without waste. Deb stood by the door. Wade went back into the hallway, and I heard him trying doors, checking rooms. I let that happen because the alternative was a confrontation about it, and I needed Phil working. "Circulator is gone," Phil said, from inside the access panel. "Not just dirty, the motor's seized. I can bypass it and run the system with gravity feed, but you'll lose zone control, and the output will be maybe 60%. Enough to keep the pipes from cracking, not enough to be warm." He paused. "You've got a shop room in this building?" I told him yes, at the east end of the addition. He said, "I need to look at the fuel supply and the secondary loop. Give me an hour." I gave him 2. He and I went through the shop room together, Phil working, me watching his hands and deciding how much I trusted him. He found a secondary loop bypass that increased the output to the main building by running it through the shop room's overhead unit heater. He needed a short piece of copper pipe and 2 compression fittings, both of which I had in my maintenance stock. We worked together in the boiler room for 3 hours, and at the end of it, the burner lit and held, and the circulator was bypassed, and heat was moving through the pipes again. The building temperature came up to 4 Celsius by late afternoon and was still rising. While Phil and I worked, Deb had found the cafeteria kitchen and taken an inventory of what was left. When I came up from the boiler room, I found her sitting at a cafeteria table with a handwritten list. She didn't offer it to me, she kept it. I noted that too. Wade had found the lower gym storage. He hadn't found the hatch. I'd replaced the shelving units over it, and the brackets were back in the wall, but he'd gone through everything on the visible shelves, and he had a folded volleyball net under one arm. When I found him there, he said he'd been cold, and it was insulation. I said, "Put it back." He held it for a moment, then dropped it on the floor and walked past me into the hallway. He was the type of man who always took things until someone made the effort to stop him. I filed that away. That evening, December 21st, heat working back into the pipes, the building temperature rising past 0 for the first time in 36 hours. The 4 of us ate from the cafeteria supplies without any discussion about how much or who went first. Phil served himself first, and served generously. Wade finished his bowl and took more from the pot without looking to see what was left. Deb served herself last, took a moderate portion, and sat at the end of the table away from Phil, and she watched the 2 of them while she ate the way someone watches a problem they've encountered before. I took what remained and watched all 3 of them, the same way I'd learned to watch the dead through a school window, not looking for a specific threat, just reading pattern, how they handled small things, where they looked when they weren't talking, who moved first and who waited. By the time the meal was done, I had a working picture of all three of them. Deb was going to be manageable. Wade was careless the way people get careless, when they've always had someone else managing the consequences, and those people weren't around anymore. Phil was something I was going to have to plan around. The dynamic in the building shifted within 24 hours of their arrival. Phil began treating the space as his to manage. He reorganized the shop room for his own tools. He decided that the cafeteria kitchen would be the shared cooking area and announced this as a policy without asking. Deb was quieter, but she was tracking everything, watching what I did. When I left the main building, where I walked in the snow, she was building a map of my patterns. I recognized it because I'd done the same thing when I was first learning how the dead moved. Wade Koppel was the problem. He was loud in ways that had nothing to do with volume. He moved carelessly. He left doors unlatched. He dropped things without looking to see what effect the sound had on the building's perimeter. On the morning of December 23rd, I watched from a second-floor window as Wade pushed open the main entrance door and stepped outside to look at something in the parking lot. One of the slow ones had gotten close to my truck, and Wade had an obvious attachment to vehicles. The door pushed against a ridge of accumulated ice and made a scraping sound that carried. 4 of the slow ones 30 meters out turned in unison. Wade stepped back inside and shut the door, but the response was already underway. They came to the entrance and pressed against the door for 40 minutes. Wade did not apologize. Christmas Eve. The temperature outside was -38, and the wind had come up from the north, which normally would have muffled noise and made the slow ones less responsive. Phil had found the cafeteria stock I'd been conserving, specifically the case of canned peaches. I'd been rationing at 1 can every 5 days, treating as a long-term reserve, and he'd opened 4 of them for a celebration he decided we were having. When I said that was not how I'd been managing the supplies, he told me it was now a shared operation, and shared decisions would be made by vote, and there were 3 of them to 1 of me. I said, "You can vote on whatever you want. That was my food before you got here, and the agreement was access to the boiler work, not access to everything I'd stored." Phil set the open cans on the table and looked at me for a moment. "We'll settle the supply question later," he said, "after the holiday." The supply question did not wait until after the holiday. That same night, I heard something in the ceiling above the library. I was in the library, doing what I'd done most evenings, reading by flashlight, geography books mostly, because I found them calming when I heard a shift of weight above me. Light, careful. The way a person moves when they don't want to make noise. Not an animal, the cadence was wrong for an animal. Too deliberate, too managed. I turned off my flashlight and sat still in the dark for 3 minutes. It shifted again. A foot, maybe 2 feet. Coming from the ceiling tiles above the section nearest the south wall. I went to the hallway outside the library and found the ceiling access hatch, a 2-foot by 2-foot panel set in the drop ceiling, the kind every school has for reaching the ductwork and conduit runs. I stood on a chair and pushed the panel up and put my flashlight through the gap and turned it on. A boy was looking back at me. He was maybe 9 years old, maybe 10, wearing a down-filled vest over a school sweatshirt and 2 pairs of socks on his feet. His hair was matted and his face was dirty, and he had a cluster of granola bar wrappers and 2 empty juice boxes and a water bottle stacked neatly beside him on the ceiling joist. He had been there long enough to organize his small store of supplies into a tidy arrangement. He looked at my flashlight without flinching, then looked at my face, and then said, "Are you the janitor?" His name was Russell Ferrand Rusty, he said. Everybody called him Rusty. He was 9 years old. He had been living in the ceiling space above the library since September 8th, the second day of the evacuation, when the bus carrying his class had turned back after encountering a blocked road, and the teachers had brought everyone back to the school. And then, in the confusion of the next several hours, Rusty had gone up through the library ceiling hatch because a friend dared him to, and then hadn't come back down because the noises outside had made it seem like a very bad idea. The teachers had left without him. He had found food from the cafeteria kitchen by crawling through the duct system above the drop ceiling, small enough to fit, careful enough not to make noise, methodical enough to have kept himself alive for 3 months. 3 months in a ceiling. I stood at the base of the library hatch and tried to make that real while he came down the ladder. The main duct trunk in the 91 edition ran east-west above the corridor and branched into every classroom and into the cafeteria kitchen. I'd replaced a section of it in 2022, and I knew every junction. A small person who understood weight distribution and was careful about noise could move through most of it. Rusty had worked that out in the first week and had been using the system as his route ever since. He had a school-issue emergency flashlight with dead batteries he'd replaced with 2 D cells from a clock on the wall. He had a fleece blanket from the library reading corner. He had a water bottle he'd been refilling from the condensate tray under the main HVAC coil, which I want to be clear about, because that is not a water source I would have identified in a month of trying. He had 3 composition notebooks and a set of colored pencils, and he had been keeping a log since the 9th of September. The entries got shorter and more careful as the weeks went on, but they never stopped. He had also filled several pages with maps to scale, annotated, showing the school perimeter and the fields as seen through the ceiling gaps that were more precise than anything I could have drawn from memory of a building I'd worked in for 11 years. I got him down from the ceiling and took him to the custodian's room because it was the warmest room I could reach without going through the cafeteria. He ate 2 bowls of oatmeal without speaking. I sat across the table and didn't ask questions until he'd finished. He told me he'd been watching the adults through gaps in the ceiling tiles. He'd seen me first, and he'd decided I was probably safe because I hadn't made loud noises or broken anything. He'd seen the 3 newcomers arrive on the 21st, and he hadn't liked what he'd observed of Phil Turno from up there. His physical condition was better than it had any right to be. He was thin, visibly so, his coat loose across the shoulders where it had fit better in September, but moving well, eyes clear, no injuries beyond a scrape on one knee from a loose sheet metal edge in the ductwork. He'd been rationing the cafeteria stock more carefully than I had in my first 3 weeks, taking from the back of shelves, rotating through different sections, so nothing looked obviously depleted from below. When I asked him how he'd decided on that approach, he said he'd read a book about camping in the school library in the first week, and rationing was in the camping book. He said this matter-of-factly. I asked if the camping book was still up there. He said no, he'd brought it with him. He took it out of his backpack and set it on the table, alongside his notebooks. The notebooks were full. He told me he'd watched Phil through the ceiling on the 22nd, the morning after the 3 arrived, and that Phil had opened every room he could access, and stood in each doorway, looking at what was in it before moving on. He described Phil's movements in the building the way a competent person describes someone who is casing something. He told me that on the 23rd, while Wade had been at the main entrance, Phil had gone into the gym storage and spent 12 minutes moving along the shelving wall with a flashlight. He had not found the hatch. Rusty had been watching from the duct access above the gym storage the entire time, flat and motionless in the dark. He told me this last part without particular drama. He said he'd decided that if Phil found the hatch, he was going to wait until Phil went below and then come down and lock it from outside. I sat with that for a moment. 9 years old. I told him he'd need to stay in the custodian's room for now. I told him not to go near the cafeteria or the gym. He looked at me with the direct, flat assessment of a 9-year-old who has survived 3 months in a ceiling and said, "What's the plan?" I said, "I'm working on it. Christmas Day." Phil found the custodian's room. He knocked twice and opened the door without waiting for an answer, and he saw Rusty sitting at the table with a geography book open in front of him. Phil looked at Rusty, looked at me, and said, "You've been hiding a boy here." The way he said it had nothing generous in it. "He was already here," I said. "He was here before any of you." Phil stood in the doorway for a moment, then said, "He eats. That changes the supply math." He turned and walked back toward the cafeteria. I heard him talking to Deb, too low to make out words. That evening, Phil told me the arrangement had to change. He wanted the full inventory, all of it, including whatever I had stored that he hadn't found, laid out and divided in 4 equal shares, with any additional finds from outside runs to be shared equally. He said if I didn't agree, he and Wade would take a systematic look at the building until they found whatever I had put aside. He said it calmly, like a man explaining a policy rather than making a threat. But the pry bar was on the table beside him. I didn't argue. I said I needed to check the boiler and I'd be back in 20 minutes with the full inventory list. Phil nodded. I went to the boiler room, and instead of checking the boiler, I went to the lower gym storage and through the hatch and down into the civil defense room. I sat at the folding table for a moment, and then I started moving things. The canned goods I couldn't move in 20 minutes, but I moved the shotgun and the remaining shells, 28 rounds by then, and the Halligan bar, and my log notebook, and my best flashlight, and the hand crank generator into a secondary position I'd identified, in the crawl space under the east wing. There was a maintenance crawl space that ran beneath the addition 40 centimeters of clearance, gravel floor, accessible through a hatch in the boiler room that was concealed behind a gas supply pipe. I'd found it in October. Nobody else knew about it. I came back to the cafeteria 23 minutes later with a list that was accurate for everything except the items I'd moved. Phil reviewed it. He crossed out 3 lines and added a notation about the diesel supply in the shop room 12 liters, which he said would be shared for the block heater on the school bus if we needed the vehicle. I told him I agreed. I watched his eyes when I said it, and I noted that he did not believe me. The next 2 days were a standoff that nobody called a standoff. Phil was in the shop room most of the time, working on something I couldn't see clearly through the window. Wade stayed near the cafeteria, eating without much conversation. Deb came and went through the building in a pattern that looked random but wasn't. She was checking all the access points, all the utility doors, testing which ones latched and which didn't. She found the crawlspace hatch in the boiler room on the afternoon of the 26th. She didn't open it. She stood there looking at it, then walked away. I watched her do this from the boiler room doorway. Rusty stayed in the custodian's room. I brought him food 3 times a day. He read every geography book within reach, and then started on the science texts. He asked me once if we were going to leave before spring. I said maybe. He said, "Phil took the keys out of your truck." I went very still. He said, "I saw him through the ceiling, this morning. He went out the east door and came back with your truck keys. He put them in his jacket pocket." I made myself breathe normally. I said, "Good to know." December 27th, 2 in the morning. I was in the crawl space below the east wing when I heard a sound from the direction of the shop room, a heavy thump, followed by something scraping across a concrete floor. I moved through the crawl space toward the east end and came up through the utility access hatch at the corner of the building. The shop room was 1 door down. Phil was in there with the diesel cans, all 12 liters. He was loading them onto a low dolly, the kind used to move appliances, along with 3 cases of canned goods from the cafeteria that he'd stacked by the shop room door. Wade was in the hallway, watching the cafeteria corridor. They were moving their own supplies out. The school bus was outside, connected to its block heater. Phil had been warming the engine for the past several hours. I stepped into the shop room doorway. Phil turned, saw me, and held up one hand. "No misunderstanding here," he said. "We're taking our share and leaving. Winter's clear enough for the road, and we know of a larger group south of Saskatoon. We're leaving you the building, the rest of the supplies, and the boy." He picked up one of the diesel cans. "I'm taking the truck keys too, because your truck has more fuel than the bus, and I may need it as a backup." He said all of this the way a man says things he's already decided. The pry bar was on the workbench at his right hand. "The boy comes with me," I said. Phil set down the diesel can and picked up the pry bar. Not threatening, he held it at his side, casual, but the choice was deliberate and visible. "He can survive in a building with supplies for 3 more months. You both can. You don't need the bus, you don't need the diesel, and you don't need to follow us. This is clean." "I'm not going to leave a 9-year-old in a building with a failing boiler in December," I said. "The bus leaves with me and Rusty, or it doesn't leave at all." Phil took 2 steps toward the door and I moved to block it. He stopped. He was bigger than me, and he knew it. And he raised the pry bar to mid-height, not swinging, holding it there, deliberate and visible. I had the Halligan bar from the crawl space, and my right hand was already on it. We stood 3 feet apart in the doorway of a shop room in a frozen Saskatchewan school at 2 in the morning, and both of us knew exactly how this was going to go. He swung first. I brought the Halligan up and took the impact on the steel. It jarred hard up both arms, and I pushed left, and he came forward, and I brought the forked end across the back of his right knee, and he went down on one knee, and I put the flat of the adze end across the side of his head. He hit the floor. He was breathing and moving slightly, but he was not going to get up and organize anything for a while. I took the pry bar from his hand and stepped back. Wade had heard it from the hallway, and he appeared in the doorway, took one look at Phil on the floor and me standing with both tools, and turned and ran the other direction. I heard the east gym door slam open, and then the sound of boots on packed snow outside, receding fast. I stood in the shop room longer than I needed to. I had put a man on the floor with a steel tool, on purpose, and something in the way I accounted for myself had shifted and was not going to shift back. I was also aware that the sound from the door Wade had slammed was already drawing responses from outside 2, 3, maybe 4 of the slow ones, realigning toward the east side of the building. I could hear them pressing against the gym door from across the building. Phil came around in about 5 minutes. He rolled to his side and looked up at me, and I handed him a shop rag from the workbench and told him to hold it to his temple. I told him Wade had left. I told him the bus was going to take me and Rusty south, and that he could come or stay. But if he came, he was going to be in the back, and he was not going to touch the wheel. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Deb." I'd forgotten about Deb. She was in the cafeteria when I found her, awake and fully dressed, coat on, backpack at her feet. She'd heard everything through the walls. She said, "I knew it was going to come to this with Phil. I want to come with you." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Where's your propane cylinder?" She reached into her backpack and took it out mostly full, like she'd said in December. I nodded. "We leave in 30 minutes. I went to get Rusty." He was already awake and dressed in his coat and vest, sitting on the edge of the folding table in the custodian's room with his backpack on. He said, "I heard the noise from the shop room. Is the man okay?" I told him the man was up and would be fine. Rusty said, "Are we going now?" I said yes. He slid off the table and followed me without another word. The problem with leaving in 30 minutes was the dead outside the east gym door. I counted at least 5 pressed against it from the sound of the movement out there, 6 or 7 from the shifting pressure against the lower panel. Wade's exit had drawn them in, and now they were stacked in the doorway alcove, which was exactly the path we needed to reach the bus. I went back through the crawl space to the maintenance hatch, came up in the boiler room, and retrieved the shotgun and the remaining shells, 28 rounds. I checked the load deer slugs in both barrels. I told Deb to bring Phil to the boiler room and to bring the dolly with the diesel cans. I had an idea about the exit route. The school bus was connected to its block heater outlet on the east side of the building, 20 meters from the gym door. The gym access tunnel, a concrete-walled passage, 4 feet wide, that ran from the lower gym storage under the east wing and opened through a steel door into the school's mechanical yard, was the route I needed. The tunnel door opened into the mechanical yard on the south side of the bus, away from where the slow ones had clustered at the gym entrance. I had not used the tunnel since October. The door at the tunnel end opened outward into the mechanical yard and was secured by a bar latch on the inside. The mechanical yard was fenced chain link, 10 feet, with a vehicle gate that opened to the east bus lane. If the gate was clear, we could load onto the bus through the south-facing door without going anywhere near the gym entrance. I left Deb and Phil in the boiler room with the diesel. I took Rusty with me through the hatch into the lower gym storage, through the civil defense room where I paused for one moment, looking at the organized shelves and the folding table and everything I'd built down here over 3 months, and into the tunnel. We moved slowly, no flashlight, one hand on the wall. I could hear the slow ones through the concrete, a low, irregular pressure, like something shifting weight against a wall. But it was distant enough. The tunnel held. The steel door at the tunnel end had a small ice ridge at the bottom, cold had worked into the gap over the months. I put my shoulder against it and it moved. Not fast, not smooth, but it moved without making a loud sound. The mechanical yard was dark just past 3 in the morning and cold in the total way that -34 produces. Your face registers pain within 30 seconds. Your exhaled breath hangs and then drops. Nobody in the mechanical yard. The slow ones were around the corner, on the east side. I could hear them, that low, shuffling, absent percussion of feet on frozen ground. But they were at the gym door and not yet here. I told Rusty to stay at the tunnel entrance, and I crossed the yard to the fence gate, padlocked. I had the Halligan bar. I worked the fork end into the hasp and leaned on it, and the hasp pulled from the post with a crack that rang across the frozen yard like a board splitting. I heard a shift in movement from the east side. They'd heard it. I had maybe 90 seconds before the leading ones came around the corner. I ran back to the tunnel entrance. Deb, Phil now. I called it quietly but directly into the opening. Then Rusty and I crossed to the bus. The block heater connector was a standard plug on a cord from the engine bay. I unplugged it and tried the door. The engine had been warming for hours. It would start. I got the door open and got Rusty up the steps. He was small, and he moved fast. Phil came through the tunnel first, limping from the knee I'd hit, carrying 1 diesel can. Deb was right behind him with the 2nd can and both backpacks. They crossed the yard without running. Phil knew better than to run where the dead might respond to the sound of it, and I got the diesel into the cargo bay and both of them up the steps. I came around to the driver's side. The leading slow one came around the building's east corner just as I put my foot on the step. It was Greencoat, the hydro technician I'd named back in September, still in the same green work jacket, moving through the frozen yard with the same searching, tilted gait I'd watched from the gym loft 100 times. He turned toward the sound of my boot on the step and came toward me. I had the shotgun, but I didn't fire. The sound would pull every last one in the tree line, so I held the barrel against the step rail and put my boot flat against his chest and pushed and got the door closed. He struck the side of the bus and I heard him pressing against the door panel as I dropped into the driver's seat. I turned the key. The engine caught on the first turn block heater. Warm diesel, good battery. I put it in reverse and backed slowly away from the building. Greencoat and 2 others followed the movement, pressing after the bus. I gave the engine enough throttle to pull clear of them, turned south across the mechanical yard, and pushed the vehicle gate open with the front bumper. It gave way cleanly. We came out on the south service lane, and I turned west onto the county road, and the school fell behind us in the mirror. I was a kilometre down the road when Deb said from the back of the bus, "The school." I looked in the driver's mirror. The school was lit from inside, not the ordinary light of a functioning building, but orange, uneven, the kind of light that moves. The shop room, most likely. The camp stove had been running when we left and something had tipped during the confrontation, a fuel canister, solvent from the maintenance shelf, something. The fire was in the east addition, working toward the junction with the original structure. I watched the windows brighten as I drove. The civil defense room collapsed when the gym floor came down. I didn't see it. I heard it from half a kilometre away, a low concussive sound that the frozen air carried flat and far across the fields. Everything I'd built in that room, everything I'd organized over 3 months, came down in approximately 4 seconds. The wool blankets, the crank generator, the sealed drums, the old government cans with their stenciled labels, all of it. I drove. The county road was drifted in places but passable. Rusty was in the seat behind mine, seatbelt on, a geography book from the library in his lap. He'd grabbed it on the way through the tunnel. He said nothing for the first 20 minutes, and then he said, "Do you know where we're going?" I said, "South. There's a community centre in Lumsden that was being used as a staging point in September. I don't know if it's still active. If it isn't, we keep going south toward Regina. The bus has enough fuel for 120 kilometres if we're careful." Rusty thought about this for a moment. He said, "Okay." He opened the geography book. I watched the road. I have had time since that night to think about what the first winter cost. The cold preserves things, including the things you'd rather not carry. Phil Turneau was alive and ambulatory when we reached Lumsden. He left us at the community centre without a word, walking away in his red hunting jacket toward the south end of the town. I haven't seen him since, and I haven't looked. Wade Coppell ran east on foot in the middle of the night at -34°C, with no gear and no plan, and 3 or 4 of the slow ones now moving in the same direction behind him. I don't think he ran very far. Deb Houck stayed at the Lumsden Centre. She knew the administration team there. One of the organisers had worked for the same school division she'd been with years earlier. She had her propane cylinder and her maintenance knowledge, and she made herself useful immediately. The last time I saw her, she was in an argument with a supply manager about whether the centre's generator room had adequate ventilation. She was right, she knew she was right, and she was going to win. Rusty Ferran's parents were alive, both of them, which is more than most 9-year-olds at the Lumsden Centre could say. His mother was already in the main hall when we arrived. She was sitting with a cup of coffee and a look on her face that I won't try to describe. She stood up when she saw Rusty come through the door, and she made a sound that had no word in it. Rusty crossed the hall at a run, and I stepped to the side to be out of the way of that moment. I stayed at the Lumsden Centre through February. I fixed things. Generators, plumbing, heating systems, door hardware, pipe runs that the freeze had cracked. I know buildings, the way I know the inside of a hockey arena, by function, by sound, by what fails first, and why. That turned out to be more useful than almost anything else I had. The dead were still out there. The winter had locked them in position across the countryside, standing in frozen fields, pressed against fence lines, gathered at road intersections where they'd been when the temperatures dropped, and as the first warmth came in late February and into March, they started moving again. Slowly at first, then with more range and purpose. The first winter had been one long pause in something that had no intention of pausing permanently. I refereed a youth hockey game at the Lumsden Centre in January. They had an outdoor rink, a cleared pad maintained by a rotation of volunteers, and when the temperature allowed, the younger residents played on it. I ran the game with a whistle I found in the equipment room. It was the most normal 20 minutes I'd had in 4 months. I called a penalty on a player for a cross-check, and the boy's father, standing rinkside in a heavy coat, complained from 6 feet away, exactly the way parents had always complained. Same expression, same gestures, same certainty that I was wrong. I penalized the boy 2 minutes, told the father the rule was the rule, and skated away. It was exactly the same as it had always been. And then the game ended, and everyone went back inside behind locked doors. And it was not the same at all. Winter does not stop the dead. It holds them. It stores them. In the spring, every frozen field and frozen ditch and frozen tree line in Saskatchewan starts to move again. Anyone who understood that going into the first winter had a better chance in the second. Anyone who spent the first winter waiting for the cold to solve the problem for them was not in a good position when March came. I survived the first winter of the outbreak under the gym floor of Birchwood Falls Elementary School. I did it with 11 years of custodian knowledge, a Halligan bar, a 12-gauge shotgun, wire snares, and the habit of watching carefully and staying quiet. I also did it by making choices I'd make differently now. I turned away people who needed shelter. I kept my heat and my food and my silence, and I calculated correctly and came through it. And something about that is not clean, and I know it. When I left the school on that bus, I left behind the notebook. Every day of those 3 months, recorded in my own handwriting, in a composition notebook with a blue cover. The date, the temperature, the count of the dead, if I could get a visual, weather, what I'd eaten, what I'd fixed, what I'd broken, a complete log. It went down with the building. I write this from the Lumsden Centre, on the back of supply requisition forms because paper is what there is. I write it because Rusty asked me to. He said he wanted to know what happened during the parts of those 3 months he hadn't seen from the ceiling. I told him I'd put it down. He said, "All of it." I said, "Most of it." He accepted that because he is 9 years old and already understands that most of it is the realistic answer to most questions. Outside, the temperature is -21. The roads south are passable, but uncertain. In the field east of the community center, there are 7 of the preserved ones standing in a loose group along the fence line, exactly where they've been since November. With the February thaw coming in 3 weeks or so, they'll be moving again. I'll be ready for that. I know the building I'm in now. I know where the tools are stored and where the fuel is kept, and who can be counted on to be quiet and careful when it matters. I have the 12 gauge with 14 rounds remaining and the Halligan bar leaning against the wall behind my door. Terry, if you're out there somewhere and you find these pages, I waited for you. 4 in the afternoon, September 4th. I waited past dark. I hope you had a reason for not coming, and I hope that reason kept you safe. I put the kettle on every morning still. First thing, out of habit. Some habits are worth keeping. The first winter is almost over. Whatever comes next, I go into it with clear eyes and steady hands. That's the best I can say. That's enough.